In our next part of our series, we're going to be talking about regulatory compliance. That's going to be a pretty big issue because with virtual clinical trials, a lot of processes will change. And so the question then becomes, what's the regulatory impact? Or more specifically, what types of changes do the regulatory frameworks currently allow? So I think the first question I want to ask is, let's focus on the two big regulatory regimes, right? The FDA in the US and EMA, I believe it's called in EU. We have Edie and you guys are probably the resident experts on those. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the overall regulatory framework and challenges for virtual clinical trials in each of those two regions? And
Yeah, absolutely. I'll get started with FDA and then tee up EMA for you. I was going to say, Maya, and we can kind of, hand off there. So a lot of folks compare FDA and EMA because they do have a similar overarching across geographical divide ethical framework for the approval of drugs, devices, investigational test articles. And of course, they're regulated as they're studied in clinical trials, right? And so in the FDA, but of course, I should say, just to be very clear, the FDA only has jurisdiction in the United States, and the EMA only has jurisdiction in Europe, right? So that's the deal. And there are definitely regulatory regimes outside of those spaces that may align, may not align, may play well with, may not even be willing to interact with, right? Those infrastructures. And of course, we have to imagine pharmaceutical sponsors as well as certain health needs, like the global pandemic of COVID, don't know geographical boundaries in that regard. And so this can become very, very intricate and complicated for anyone and everyone who is involved in the conduct of research. So the FDA, in terms of virtual clinical trials, had actually been saying, and even is on the record early in 2019 as saying, we would really like to see clinical trials, and I forget the exact quote, but essentially we would like to see clinical trials being brought to the patient and being more focused on patient engagement, right? And so you began this chicken and egg dance that I know Maya and I have had a lot of great conversations about and dialogue about, of the FDA pushing the idea and almost on its face making it look as if, we 100% endorse the idea of even truly virtual clinical trials, not even the hybrid, right? But 100% virtual clinical trials. But of course, if you talk to any sponsor who's operated with the FDA, they're going to say, right, but there wasn't a test case and there weren't specific guidances. And there were a lot of concerns about maintaining safety or data quality. And we can't take we can't make the business case for going all the way down the road on a hope or a prayer, right, that the FDA will accept this at the end of the day. And now what we've arrived at, and again, this is a bit of a sweeping broad, generalization to kind of paint the picture, is the FDA allowing significant regulatory flexibility in certain spaces that expedited our ability to act during COVID in clinical research, whether it was related to COVID or not, and has paved the way, if we were to keep some of these flexibilities, to truly implement actual hybrid or virtual decentralized trials, right? And it created this test case that the chicken and the egg dance was about. And so that's really where we're at. I can speak broadly to the fact that, the FDA has been discussing harmonization with EMA at a global level since the early 2000s. I think 2009 was when they harmonized across GCP, and then in the 10 years since then, or I guess now it's been 12, we've seen significant chatter about this need to harmonize, and of course COVID only expedites that, but we definitely hadn't achieved that at the time that COVID hit. So do you want to kind of fill in the other side of that, Maya, as far as EMA goes?
Yeah, I was going to actually touch upon what you said, like the last sentence, that we haven't actually been able to fully harmonize. But I think there is a lot of efforts in that direction, because I remember maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I met two of the directors, the FDA patient engagement director, and then the engagement director of the EMA. And then we were basically in one room chatting about patient engagement. And it turned out that they have this tradition of exchanging stuff, like European EMA basically staff visiting the FDA, working there, and the other way around. So, and that was actually across the board. So I see the efforts trying to harmonize in a way. Traditionally, though, what happens and what happened during COVID, the EMA is kind of following the FDA's recommendations. For some reason, the FDA has been always very like proactive, very fast in responding to what's happening. It's also true that most clinical trials are being done in the States. So if you look at the map, you see that research is like the research in the States, it's a lot more than anywhere else. Of course, Europe is the next region where there is a lot clinical trials as well. But then traditionally, EMA is generally following. So what happened when the pandemic started? The FDA came out with some new recommendations, what you should do. Then the EMA said, these are the recommendations, and they were more or less the same. And then each of the countries following EMA started actually having more or less same recommendations as well within the countries. The difference here, though, is that we're slightly behind when it comes to, when I say we, I'm in Europe, and that's why I say we. In Europe, we're slightly behind this experimentation around decentralized clinical trials in general. So let's say there is less know-how, definitely on the business side as well. And obviously, DMA also has not that much experience with virtual clinical trials. And as we were discussing with Raymond earlier, before we started the conversation, there's details, like for example, the e-consent.
Yep, this is a huge one.
Yes, it's a huge one. But then even if EMA says we approve e-consent, for example, and we recommend you use e-consent, what happens is that in some of the countries, e-consent is almost impossible because of the way they translate what e-signature is. I'm not sure if the States is the same, but in Europe, there is a big difference between the ways the law, how the law accepts the government on a governmental and basically in the law, how they accept the e-signature. And that makes it very difficult in some countries to have a real e-consent in the way you would imagine. Mm-hmm. So I think that will change with the time, and it will kind of harmonize as well, but it will also involve not only the recommendations by the EMA, but also some movement towards more digitalization in the countries, which is happening. And I can see that a lot of money going there already. One thing that EMA did differently, though, is you mentioned that the FDA was one of the first authority to start speaking about decentralized clinical trials and how you should do clinical trials in general more patient-centric, and we should engage the patients better. And I remember I was on one of the conferences, the DIA actually, and there was one representative of the FDA. He literally went out on the microphone and he said, we recommend decentralized clinical trials. We want to see that happening, basically. So I witnessed that also. But then the EMA haven't had such a position before COVID. But what EMA did, though, is immediately after they realized that COVID is changing the whole game, they started really they started thinking about this business case that you said was missing in the States. How can we actually lead the business towards how we should conduct the decentralized clinical trials? And there is one initiative that some of you may already know, some not. It's called Trials at Home. It's actually multi-organizational type of initiative. It's funded by the European Union. I think it's also kind of approved by the EMA as well. So what they're doing, there are some big pharma companies, some academia, like universities, some other institutions. And so they're working together on the first decentralized clinical trial, pilot in Europe. They call it the first one. They want to do the full virtual experience. Yeah. They will also compare it with an arm, and that should lead to these standards. Eventually, that will be the first guidances for the business after that.
Yeah, that's terrific. It sounds very encouraging and definitely a concrete step, like you said, to pave the way. I'm curious, Dan, I'd love to get your particular perspective on this because your site has been unusually innovative and had changed a lot of processes, I think, right after the COVID pandemic hit. So I believe you've been consulting with Edie on how to modify the processes to comply. So can you talk a little bit about what you're doing differently as a site on your own initiative and how you managed to get comfort from regulatory perspective that
Yeah.
you could do these things?
I like that you use the word use comfort, because I think for those of us that operate trials where the rubber meets the road, it can be uncomfortable to the point where it paralyzes you, and you say, you know what, I'm just not going to. How about we just shut down? How about we just shut down and we just don't do anything, and we just say that we're doing non-essential, non-COVID-19 related research because we just can't wrap our minds around it. So for us, it was very much it was very much, we need to adapt, we need to roll with the punches, because the alternative is not a viable option for us. I don't want to lay off my staff. I don't want to look them in the eyes and tell them, hey, I know that your family's getting laid off from your jobs, you have to also. So there was frankly no other alternative but to get with Edie and say, Edie, we're going to figure this out, right?
And we go,
And
sure, of course.
yes, and so it was. I mean, I think back on the early days. I think it was March of
Was.
last year, and I just remember getting into the mindset of there needs to be a way, there needs to be a path that needs to be forged forward here. And the way that I looked at the challenge, it was a matter of what we know we can do physically, what was logistically possible, but then working closely with Edie to say, tell me when and where I'm coloring outside the lines. Like, define the lines for me, because my team, I'm going to give my team a box of crayons and I'm going to set them into the wild with the creativity and the innovation, and I'm going to push for it, and I'm going to encourage that we make mistakes. I just need to know where the lines are.
Mhm.
And so that's how Edie and I partnered up, and then taking everything, and the way that we would make it work is I would come to Edie and say, this is what we came up with, and Edie would then help me codify that into policy, into SOP, and say, okay, great. Everything that you just said fits within the lines. Here's how we need to document and evidence that we're being compliant in that arena. And honestly, it's just having a conversation, right? It's just
Yeah.
having a
Well,
dialogue
and
about the
starting
regulatory.
to have the creativity. I love that you said creativity, right? Because that was part of it. That was so critical. So often I have clients who come to me and it's more of a prescription, right? Just tell me exactly what to do. And I can do that. I can tell you the regular way that whatever type of organization you're in conducts this. Having said that, that doesn't mean that there's not flexibility for you to do it a gazillion different ways that might lead to better recruitment, better retention,
Yeah.
better data, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's really critical in this environment. You know, in March, we were just thinking, my gosh, emergency preparedness,
Yeah,
right? That
exactly.
was really, it wasn't, oh my gosh, we're going to be operating in this upended environment for a year or two. It was, okay, this is going to be in the next couple of months. We'll get it under control. And so you saw the changes not really being top down operational exploration, but really more intentional band-aid exploration, as I would call it, right? It was, do we have our emergency preparedness? Are we sure about what we can do remotely and what we can't? Are we sure what our flexibility is? Let's tweak. Whereas by the time we got to late April, there was that full realization of, oh, we're gonna be living this life for a while. And so that was when I really started to encourage Daniel and Macro more of a look. I do think you need to get the crayons out and start coloring, because you're going to have to rethink your approach from A to Z. And when you change your operations and the way you reach your patients and the way you structure your trials, of course, you need to document that. It's not as much about whether or not you can do it as knowing what you want to do and then exploring, like Daniel said, where the lines are, right? And at least I will say, and I've said this throughout, you know, with all the pressure it was on the FDA in the United States, I did feel like they moved as an organization relatively swiftly on providing regulatory flexibilities, because the last thing you want in the world is to go through all that operational rehash, SOP and document the heck out of it. You're, you know, greenlit to go, and then the lines change because the FDA or EMA or any other regulatory body, frankly, can't make up their mind exactly what their response is going to be. And so I felt like they implemented some pretty big steps in relation to, and EMA basically followed them, right? In terms of things that we could utilize in our space, and how long we would be allowed to utilize them, right? You know, how long that would last, whether or not they would frankly explore it for long-term use. Kind of that put your money where your mouth is, FDA, if you want to say for a few years that you want us to explore these modalities. then here are some ways that are easier for us to reach them.
Yeah. So what were some of the specific processes or things that you're doing a little bit differently now than maybe a couple of years ago as a result of these efforts? Are you doing remote consenting, for instance, or home visits?
Remote consenting was a big part of the conversation. It almost feels like the final frontier because of the nuances we identified in the
Mm,
previous session that we did. Honestly, it starts with a compliance mindset. It starts with having a culture of compliance. It starts with just working with the team and having them understand that everything that we encourage them to do is within the framework of research compliance. And it may not feel that way at macro, and that's very deliberate. Some of my team members came from academia and they're operating, and then suddenly they look back and they're like, it doesn't feel compliant. And I have to tell them that's a very deliberate feeling because we've encouraged a lot of innovation, we've encouraged a lot of creativity, but the compliance is there. That's what Edie and I work so thoroughly on. And then when they look back and every now and then they have a glance at our policies and SOPs, it's like, oh, okay, yes, we're doing this correct. We're doing things right. We're doing things the right way. So it starts with a compliance culture, having a culture of compliance without it feeling like the traditional compliance. The second thing that we're doing differently is we're actively encouraging the team to participate in that process, not just the creativity of operational logistics, but also what's working and what isn't, and really encouraging them to understand that whatever policy and procedure we put in place, yes, it's backed by the regulatory compliance, but as Edie said, it's not prescriptive, right? So you need to be able to look and say, hey, this doesn't work because it doesn't work with the patient flow. It doesn't work for the patient experience. It doesn't work for the way that the monitors interface with us, or frankly, it doesn't work for my workflow. And so I encourage, it's an interesting word that I'm going to use, but I encourage that conflict because without that conflict and without the culture of being able to have a dialogue around the conflict, we can't move past this is just how it's done, as opposed to I'm going to challenge the way it's done and let's see what we can do to work together and make that a compliant way, a compliantly new way of doing things. Now, in terms of what we were physically doing, I mean, at the height of the pandemic, one of my team members was flying into the eye of the storm in New York City to do a visit out of a patient's home. And
wow.
at the height of the pandemic, we were contracting with physicians in New York City for one of our patients who was normally flying once a week from New York City, catching the red eye flight, being in Los Angeles for her visit, and then hopping on the red eye flight that same night and being back in New York under 24 hours. This is pre-COVID. She did that because this trial was her only viable treatment option, and she could only get 1 day off of work. That was the only thing that her employer said, you'll get 1 day. And macro made that 1 day work. We made that work with travel logistics, flight, hotel, I mean, everything detailed to the point of, hey, we've got Postmates, your lunch is on its way. So by the time you get here, you just go to the patient lounge and you're having your lunch is done. So just the design thinking of the patient experience made that possible for that patient to not drop out. And then when the pandemic hit, she was heartbroken because she said, it's not like I don't want to participate. It's not like I want to drop out. I just cannot get on a plane right now. I can't. My employer's saying that if you get on the plane, I lose my job because they can't risk the exposure.
Mm,
And so what we did was we pivoted and we said, well, we'll bring the trial to you. And that was that. I mean, I can't even tell you. I can't get through the email I got from the patient because such a tearjerker about the difference that it made that we were there in her home with an EKG machine, with a team, with a familiar face that she had seen for weeks up until that point, in New York City. I mean, that was huge,
so
right?
the,
And
And
I think the big
that's
deal about
amazing.
that was like, for me, this is Daniel reading me that email, sharing me, the intimate details of the situation, how COVID's blocked it. At this point, we've addressed, like I said, some of those earlier detected issues of emergency preparedness. Okay, now we can deliver IP straight to a patient. Let's talk about remote monitoring. That's probably coming next. How equipped are you really to do that? What is that? And so we were moving through these steps, and then you get this phone call and you go, and for me, it's the sorting of all that information and the vetting of all the regulatory flexibility to be able to go, okay, so it sounds like you're research site wants to do are emergent patient visits that could potentially be in home. And you will be providing and contracting what types of resources? Will there be a nurse? Okay. Will they'll be licensed in the state? They have to be licensed in the state where the patient resides. Okay, so let's talk about who we're contracting. Let's get that process started in vetting. Then, and so starting all the vendor processes and the logistics, and then simultaneously, while he is taking on some of the business side of that and integrating that, then I'm documenting. So here's who's here we're going to work with. Here's how we have the process. Here's who qualifies for the emergent in-home visit. Here's how we handle it. Here's we set up the logistics of it. So by the time the staff member is getting on the plane, everyone's been vetted, every contract's been signed, there's an SOP documented. So if anyone wants to come ask how we did it, we can show great rationale and thought there. And admittedly saying at the same time, look, this is a bit unprecedented, okay? It's not as if you can write emergent clinical research SOP into Google and find a gazillion examples the way you would with, say, informed consent, right? Or any other area. So this is a bit unprecedented, but this is where you're using that regulatory mindset and rationale of, are you holding patient safety paramount, right? And I felt very strongly, and still do, that this is a perfect example of what both FDA and EMA said. Look, there are going to be trials that can't be stopped. It's actually in the better interest of the patient to try to continue the trial and basically, for lack of all the very dense language, get creative but stay compliant to do it. And so I said, look, we could get audited. There could be a finding because this is unprecedented. Do I think that's going to happen? No. Especially with all the thought, all the proof, all the vetting, and all those T's crossed in the process. What were you going to say, Maya?
I want to say that I'm just listening to Daniel, in this incredible story, and
I know. I know. That's why I love macro.
Exactly. Also listening to you, Edie, but it feels like this is not that much connected to the regulatory framework. It's like people getting creative, doing whatever they're doing with passion, and basically make it work, no matter what actually happens there within the frames, but ensuring safety, but still it was about you wanting to achieve that. Because I have the contrary example actually here in Europe, a lady with very severe cancer, and this entire family, they kind of contact us and ask us, can you help us find clinical trial? And I was like, okay, tell me what happens, because what happens? So it turned out that she was in a clinical trial in Switzerland because it was only there. She's actually originally from Dubai. Wow. But she was willing to go to Switzerland to stay there, live there, just so that she can be in this clinical trial, because that was her only hope, basically. She has 3-4 kids, something like that. And basically she wants to live, right? And when the pandemic started, no matter what the EMA recommendations were, etc., and Switzerland is out of the EU, but they're also following these recommendations, the sponsors and the sites said, you know what, you should better leave. You better leave because it's very dangerous for you here. But if she leaves, that means that she can no longer participate in this clinical trial. And no one did anything to help her in this case. I was asking, okay, what about virtual visits? What about we actually researched if the component can be also imported in Dubai to see if you can actually get the drug, because that was an additional complexity. And it was possible. But then the sponsor and the site didn't do actually what they are required in order to really support her in this case. So yeah, it was a lot of hassle. So what I'm just listening, hearing actually in the end of the day, is not the regulatory here and the frameworks preventing actually this DCT, but also the lack of creativity and the will of people to make it work.
And I mean, not that I want to ding people or be negative, but there is a certain amount of truth in that, Maya. And Daniel can tell you, I jump up and down on that soapbox all the time. And you even heard me be passionate about, there's a risk attached, absolutely, and we are a risk averse, industry in that regard. And I understand the examples you've given from sponsors who say, yeah, right, FDA, you dangle this out there, but you're not really going to let us use it, and that's valid. But at the same time, there's also, I think, a lack of pushing the edge, right? There is this certain amount of, well, we've always done it this way. It's worked. we'll wait for somebody else to champion the change.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Whereas macro's like, no, we're just going to do it. Like, pandemic, sure, let's do it then too. Because
Yeah.
macro was really embracing that before COVID. I think it was just heightened and expedited,
Yeah.
right? And highlighted through COVID.
Yeah, and in one of the future topics that we touch upon with leadership's role, one of the things that I'll talk about then is the role that leadership needs to. There's such a vacuum of leadership. Let's just call it that. There's a lot of, there's a lot of thought leadership. There's a lot of expertise, but when it comes down to the leadership that's going to actually help organizations cope with the change into that direction, we've got an entire segment dedicated to that. That is directly related, Maya, with what you said about the lack of wanting to push and support those patients and meeting them where they're at.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to understand, what didn't change from regulatory. Because like, as you're talking, Maya,
Mhm.
I see what you're saying, how you're teasing out the actual regulatory framework versus what is really more the responsibility at a sponsor level or a site level to push that regulatory envelope to really utilize all that flexibility. And for me, I didn't see any change, and I don't think there should be necessarily, in terms of the overarching expectation we have of regulatory. There's a pathway that you have to follow. There are infrastructure, check points that you have to apply to, receive approval, notify, and safety report, just as we always, would have anticipated. You're seeing still obviously a need for documentation at the site level, as far, whether it relates to the quality assurance mechanisms, the SOPs, the training. So these things haven't really changed, right? It's just the topics. If you're suddenly going to be a macro pushing that regulatory envelope and you're going to do e-consent or you're going to do emergent home visits, you better have that all thought out, and you better have your staff that are going to be involved appropriately trained and given appropriate resources. You bet, you know what I mean? Like, you have to have those ducks in a row if you're going to do it. I think what's going to be, I'll say interesting because I'm a reg nerd, in the next year to 18 months is going to be when we're starting to truly resume a more regular auditing schedule and monitoring schedule. Whether that is on-site or remote, I don't think makes any difference, but we will begin to actually audit what happened in 2020 is my point. And that will begin to be, sent to the FDA and the EMA as a representation or as a justification to move forward with, a new drug application, a new device indication, whatever it might be. So that's where that rubber is going to meet the road. And we're going to find out for sure if these organizations like FDA and EMA are going to honor all the flexibility that they maybe tried to give us, or at least, put forth the image that they were wanting to provide us during these tough times, or whether we push too much to the envelope and they're going to go, and scooch you back a little bit. And that's, we're just not going to know. And that's a scary place.
Yeah.
I mean, it's exciting, but it's scary.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question. So I'm hearing there's actually quite a lot of flexibility if you interpret the regulations accordingly, and certainly if you take what the leadership of the regulators are saying at face value. But like you said, Edie, we'll see the audit results shortly, and I think a lot of people, the incentive is to not be the first, and to see if the vision actualizes. Is there anything from an incentive standpoint? This is probably a bigger picture systemic issue, but from a regulatory framework, is there anything that regulators or sort of legislatures can do to sort of shift the incentive mix a little bit to get rid of some of that risk averseness? Because it's really harmful to the industry to be
It
so
is.
mired in against change, right? I mean, net negative
Right.
for society as a whole. It's no question,
Well,
right?
and I think there's two levels where we need change. I think each individual regulatory regime, whether you're, Europe, the United States, Africa, like whichever one you're in, my guess is your primary end user would agree with me when I say your regulations probably were written, 10, 20, or 30 years behind the innovation that we're actually seeing. A perfect example of that is all the AI devices we're seeing that qualify as a device under FDA regulations. But when those particular FDA regulations for devices were written, they weren't written thinking about an Apple Watch. They were written thinking about a heart stent. Very different types of devices, right? And so the regulatory pathway that's available for someone in that AI development space becomes exceedingly complicated merely because the regulations are outdated, not because the FDA actually wants to make it really complicated for you, like with intention, right? And so I think you're seeing in each regime a need to try to move up to the time, the most current time you can with your regulations and your flexibility for current technologies. And that was true before COVID. It's only going to be more true after COVID. So maybe that gives us an opportunity to do that, as well as what we started the topic conversation with, which is that harmonization across regimes or greater willingness to have reliance across regimes, because that on a global level slowed us down in a, how do I say it? For all the good that we did with the FDA and EMA adopting regulatory flexibility in the middle of the COVID, the fact that we don't have global harmonization, yet the pandemic doesn't know geographical boundaries, slowed down our reaction and changed from culture to culture and geographic space to space for our patients, most importantly, what was available to them, how rigorously it was tested, how heavily regulated it was, how much they could trust it, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the problem. That's the inherent problem that COVID, I think, so rightly exposes.
Yeah.
Raymond, I know we got to run off, but a quick 10-second thought on that. You asked about the legislature, right?
Yeah.
And I think what it is too is we need to go out and do a better job at educating the community, the non-research community, about the very real impact that the research community has on their health outcomes and their ability to equitably access treatments. Because once you make that connection and clinical trials becomes this thing that's not so obsolete and I don't know what that is, and maybe I don't want to be a guinea pig, as the sooner we can get the community and people to understand and connect that dot and understand that I want my mom to live longer, I want my uncle to be around for my nephew's birthday, then you can connect their need to go and change the legislature, make some noise about what are you doing that's preventing me from participating in this research, and how do we change that?
Well, look at Maya. I mean, look how Maya joined our industry. It's a perfect story, right? Of exactly someone who had, a very personal tie to, and yet became a force to be reckoned with in the industry because, and I love it. I think we need more folks who want to be disruptors in that way, because we do get really, really inundated in the healthcare enterprise as a whole, which I consider, clinical trials to be a part of. We've just always done it this way. Like, this cute, pedantic, like, you don't know what you're doing.
Right.
We've always done it this way. And you need disruption.
Yeah. And I'm sure we can go on and on because it's a complex issue. But I think that the main points that I got out of this is a little disappointing in the sense that, we're seeing a lot of aspirational leadership, to embrace sort of the change brought about by the urgency of the COVID-19, but still a lot of resistance and skepticism within the actual people that are actually being regulated and whether the regulators will actually follow through. And so it's a little disappointing to hear that, but definitely inspiring to see Jen's example of what you can do if you are proactive and you don't let the regulations sort of constrain what you can do, but you start with what the end vision is and what the goal is, and then figure out how to work within the regulatory framework. So that was very encouraging. I do hope members of the regulatory community do see this webinar. So we'll probably have to do some email marketing because I think it's an important message for regulators.
Well, and I hope they have more to share, right? And to add to the conversation. I want to hear all the experiences that happen in all the geographic spaces and all the regulatory regimes. Maybe some, maybe to your point, Raymond, when we hear, even more stories, maybe there's actually more stories like macro out there than we realize, right? Maybe we have reason to be more optimistic than it sounds on its face. It's certainly what I'd like to believe. And what I'm going to continue preaching. And so, on that note, if there are regulatory folks watching it, please ping us, talk to us about it. Tell us what your experience was.
I was going to say the same, Edie. Exactly. There are some really good examples out there that might be not in the States or Europe. I actually would give an example with Australia, because they united around the whole idea of decentralized clinical trials and very quickly, like, changed regulations, changed infrastructure. They did a lot actually to make it happen, and now it's happening, and it's actually smoothly happening. So what I think, you were speaking about audits, I think what should happen after this audit period of time, maybe they should just connect together these authorities, these regulators, and start looking at the best practices in all the regions out there, and that would maybe lead to a better harmonization. I would also say that ICH-GCP, great initiative back then, but I think it's about time to revision the terms, the definitions, all these things, because it's not about just the regulations when it comes to technology. It's about the whole process and the whole stakeholders, interactions, patients, investigators, sites, this should be rethink once again. And maybe we need to think of something like long term. I really hope that one day the regulators won't be just reactive to the situation, but they will be the leaders. What should be the long term vision for clinical trials? Technologies are changing, industry is changing, people are changing. So, how do they imagine the long term, decentralized, or whatever we call it, clinical trials?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I want to
great point. Bring in the hero stories. We need more of those.
Please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
thank you.